I made this video called Electronic Arts Why They're Hated, and one of the comments under that video stood out to me. It said, "Frankly, Activision Blizzard is just as bad, if not worse. They fly under the radar more than EA manages to." And there were many others expressing similar feelings. I think you would agree that EA and Activision are comparable companies. They've had similar evolutions and today are viewed in a very similar way by the gaming community. It's hard to know which is truly hated more than the other, but EA is the go-to one to complain and make jokes about. To me anyway, it seems like they function as sort of a lightning rod, attracting some of that negative attention away from the others. And look, I'm not trying to defend or put down either one of them, but I have witnessed some pretty strong hatred toward Activision, and I think it makes sense to take a look and try to explain some of the reasons behind it. If you're not familiar, Activision is one of the biggest makers of video games. They've been behind some of the most successful franchises that the industry has ever seen. I am talking about Guitar Hero, Destiny, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and, well, of course, Call of Duty. In 2008, they made a deal that made them the owners of another popular video game publisher called Blizzard, which gave them control of all these other major titles, including World of Warcraft. That deal helped Activision leap ahead of Electronic Arts in terms of sales, and still today, by almost any measure, Activision remains the bigger of the two. Many people have disapproved of the merger and argue that they've been changing Blizzard for the worst, which I guess right there could be a potential reason to dislike them. However, to keep things simple, I'm going to mostly ignore the Blizzard end of things from this point and keep things focused on the Activision brand. I have identified 5 main reasons behind the hatred, and I should say that the first one is easily the biggest, to a point where the following 4 reasons could be considered extensions of it, and that is their CEO, Bobby Kotick. It is a complicated issue because on one hand, he is responsible for most of the things that people don't like about Activision, but on the other hand, he is easily the biggest reason behind the company's success. In fact, I think it's a safe assumption to say that Activision would not exist today without him. I say that because in the early 1990s, when the company was deep in debt, losing money, and in desperate need of direction, he was the one who came in and he saved it. He led a team that paid $440,000 to gain 30% ownership, enough control to place himself in the position of CEO. Once he was in charge, he made a bunch of changes that over the past 3 decades have raised the value of the company to tens of billions of dollars. So before we get too deep into all of the hatred, I think it's important to understand what was happening with Activision in the days before Bobby Kotick and how he was able to save them. The company goes back to 1979, a time when the video game industry was dominated by Atari. David Crane worked for Atari as a video game developer and I guess overall was feeling disrespected by the company. See, at that time, each game was generally created by a single person, and I think he was reasonable in requesting that the designers be credited on their games, and even receive some kind of royalty payment based on how well their game sells. But the management at Atari wouldn't honor those requests, so David Crane and many of the other designers were upset about it. It all escalated when Atari sent out this memo that listed the sales figures for each game that they sold over the past year. The intention of it was to let everyone see what the market responded better to so they'd be able to adjust their designs accordingly, but it completely backfired. In the words of David Crane, "When I saw a memo that the games for which I was 100% responsible had generated over $20 million in revenues, I was one of the people wondering why I was working in complete anonymity for a $20,000 salary." Not long after that, he and 3 other key designers named Alan Miller, Larry Kaplan, and Bob Whitehead left Atari to start their own video game development company, and I like this, they called it Activision so they would appear before Atari alphabetically. In 1980, they released some of their first games like Boxing and Checkers, and by 1982, they had released some of their best sellers like River Raid and Pitfall. Actually, Pitfall was created by David Crane himself, and I know that because the designers were always given credit for their games.
Pitfall, designed by David Crane for Activision.
And all of these games, by the way, were made for the Atari 2600. They were the first company, other than Atari, to make games for that system, which made them the first ever third-party developer. Today, most video games are not made by the company that makes the console, and Activision, all the way back in 1980, was the first company to break that tradition. It was a strong start for them, but things took a major turn in 1983, and the entire video game market came crashing down. You could even make the argument that Activision was somewhat responsible for it. Their success as a third-party developer made a bunch of other companies want to enter that market by doing the same thing. But instead of competing with Activision based on quality, most of them chose to take the easier route by competing with them on price. Before you knew it, the market was flooded with all of these low-quality, rushed-out titles that made the public shy away from video games in general. From there, Activision was never the same. They were forced to downsize, all 4 of the founders left, and they transitioned into making computer games because that was the stronger market at the time. The computer games seemed like a logical step, but from what I can tell, they never had much success with it. It led them to buy this company called Infocom that was known for their very early text-based computer games. The following year, they changed their name from Activision to Mediagenic when they started making software for business purposes. When Bobby Kotick took over, I'm guessing he was more interested in that Activision name than anything else because it still carried a reputation of quality. Right away, he changed the name of the company back to Activision, he refocused on games, and moved their headquarters away from their competitors in Silicon Valley down to Los Angeles. He embraced that reputation by releasing some high-quality, well-received games. By the later part of the 1990s, they used that reputation to make deals with Disney and other studios to make games using their characters. They started acquiring competing developers, and by the 2000s, they were once again among the top of their industry. So back to my list. Bobby Kotick, since he first took over, he adapted this overall profit-focused approach to running things. This right here is the core of the issue, right? Many of these video game companies give off the impression that their primary goal is to make money, to squeeze as much from it from their players in any way that they can. It's a tricky situation because in so many of these cases, it seems like what's good for the company is bad for the players, and I don't know if anyone represents that concept better than Bobby Kotick. He is like a hero to investors, but a villain to the customers. For example, when he made this joke about how the company's goal was to take all the fun out of making video games. Obviously, that's a statement that doesn't go over well with the players and the public in general, but he made that statement to the investors where it did go over well. So for the rest of my list, I'm going to be talking about things that stem from Bobby Kotick and his profit-focused approach that have not been received well by the gaming community. The next reason I have is lack of originality, because Activision sticks so closely to this model of investing all of their resources into proven, profitable franchises as opposed to taking some chances by producing some new, original stuff. I mean, you can see it. How many Call of Duties or Tony Hawk's Pro Skater or Guitar Hero games have they released that are typically not all that different from the ones that came before it? Going back again, a big part of Bobby Kotick's initial comeback was releasing titles based on previous successes like Zork or Pitfall. In that deal in 2008, when they took control of Blizzard, they received the rights to all of these video games, and when referring to the ones that Activision didn't want to continue, Bobby Kotick said, "With respect to the franchises that don't have the potential to be exploited every year on every platform with clear sequel potential that can meet our objectives of over time becoming $100 million plus franchises, that's a strategy that has worked well for us." See, it's things like this that make me think he is embracing his role as a villain. I understand that is their proven strategy, but I'm sure there was a much gentler way to say it that doesn't include the word exploit. Either way, there are many gamers out there, probably many of the people watching this, that would rather see something new and original come from Activision rather than the 17th Call of Duty game. My next reason is an extension of that: ignoring franchises. Their strategy of exploiting franchises doesn't just prevent originality, it also prevents them from pursuing beloved franchises that maybe don't have $100 million potential. Spyro is a good example of this. They acquired the rights to the franchise in that 2008 deal and have done very little with it. The Reignited trilogy in 2018 would be the biggest thing. It remasters the first 3 games. There was Skylanders as well, but the fans want more. It is the same thing with Crash Bandicoot. Those original games made by Naughty Dog were the reason that I wanted a PlayStation in the 1990s. Obviously, there have been some less well-received games that followed, but Activision took over the rights in 2008, and it took them about a decade to really do anything with it. They canceled development of this game called Crash Landed that the fans were really looking forward to, and it wasn't until 2017 when they released, again, this remaster compilation, and then Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, in 2020. I'm just saying, if you're a fan of these iconic PlayStation characters or something else that they own the rights to and refuse to utilize, I imagine that you're pretty upset with Activision for not doing much with them. My next reason is a wrongful termination lawsuit that happened in 2010. Now, This is a crazy story. See, Infinity Ward is part of Activision. They are the video game developer that makes the Call of Duty games. In 2002, two of the founding members of it were Vince Zampella and Jason West. Well, in 2009, Activision was pushing to have their next Call of Duty game, called Modern Warfare 2, to be released in time for the holiday season. Allegedly, Bobby Kotick and Activision promised a percentage of the video game sales to Vince and Jason and the entire Infinity Ward team if they had the game done in time. And they did finish it in time. It came out in November and was actually one of the most successful releases of all time, with sales of hundreds of millions of dollars almost right away. That meant that Vince and Jason and the rest of the team were set to receive $54 million from those sales. A couple months later, everything went south. Before any money was paid to Jason and Vince, they were fired from Activision, which according to their deal meant that they were no longer entitled to the money. Those two claim that they were fired out of nowhere, which led to a wrongful termination lawsuit. Activision claimed that the firing was justified because they were acting inappropriate, and the word that was used was misconduct. Then Activision filed a countersuit claiming that they wanted to get fired because they were working with their competitor EA to establish a new company separate from Activision. I don't know if that claim was accurate or not, but they did in fact work with EA to start a new company called Respawn within a few months of the firing that went on to create the popular game called Titanfall. I feel I should point out that this situation has some major parallels to what happened between Atari and Activision 30 years earlier. You know, it's just Activision on the other side of it now. And then the Infinity Ward employees came in with their own lawsuit against Activision as well, so the entire thing was a mess. In the end, Activision settled these lawsuits for undisclosed payments, each thought to be in the tens of millions of dollars. No one outside of it truly knows what happened there. It comes down to who you want to believe, but the entire situation did not do much to help the public's perception of Activision. My last reason, you know it had to be coming, microtransactions. I'm sure anyone who has spent much time playing something made by Activision has encountered these. They are certainly not the only company that does it, but they are one of the bigger offenders. Again, it fits into this category of things that make money, are good for the investors, but not appreciated by the players. So there you have it, 5 reasons united by a common theme as to why Activision is so hated. Let me know in the comments, how do you feel about Activision? Are they just kind of following the trend of the industry, or are they taking things a little bit too far? It's hard to deny that they do put out some amazing games, and maybe that's why a company that receives so much hatred is able to be so successful. Everyone's willing to put up with all the negatives to get to the positives. Let me know if you agree with that, and any other thoughts you have about Activision or anything else in this video, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching. This right here is one of the most successful franchises of all time. Aside from a killer catchphrase and theme song, it has an anime show that's been consistently running since the 90s, over 20 movies, a best-selling series of video games, and a popular trading card game. The name Pokemon is short for Pocket Monsters, referring to a collection of characters that famously started with 150 or 151 with Mew, and has since grown to, is that right, 896 of them. Pikachu has to be the most popular one, and good luck finding anybody who can't identify him. I was in the 3rd grade when the Pokemon craze hit hard, and you could say I was a bit obsessed. I spent hours playing Pokemon Blue for the Game Boy. I would watch the anime every day before school. I saw one of the first movies in the theater. I had all the merchandise. Folders, keychains, books, a puzzle. I remember that Burger King had these promotional toys, and I was sure to get every one of them. Oh, and the cards. That may have been my biggest obsession. I would wait outside of Toys R Us and rush in with the crowd when they got a new shipment of booster packs. We weren't allowed to trade them during school, so we would rush home at the end of the day and negotiate trades for, I don't know, the next hour or so. I can specifically remember when I first saw the new packages for the Jungle set, the Fossil set, and the Base 2 set. Now, when the Team Rocket set came out, it was toward the end of the 3rd grade, and I was starting to lose interest. And I know, it sounds like I may have taken things a little far with it, and I'm not going to argue with you there, but you know what? Pretty much every person I knew was the exact same way. Considering it got so popular so fast, you might be tempted to call this a fad.
Just how long will this fad last? Retailers hope well into the holiday shopping season.
It did fade out for me and many others, but here we are more than 20 years later, and there's still a strong market for new shows, new movies, new games, and new cards. Look at Pokemon Go, for heaven's sake. This was actually one of my most requested video ideas, so given the nature of the channel, I figured that I would take this opportunity to talk about some of the companies behind this franchise. First off, to get this out of the way, we all know about Nintendo. They're the ones who manufacture and sell the video games, in addition to owning 34% of the Pokemon Company. But you have to understand that there is too much going on there, and they deserve their own video. So for today, I'm just gonna leave it at that, and talk about some of the lesser known companies that have been more reliant on Pokemon for their success. Starting with Game Freak. I have the most to say about Game Freak because their co-founder and current CEO is Satoshi Tajiri, who happens to be the person who created Pokemon. All the way back in 1978, a new arcade game was released called Space Invaders. I'm sure that we've all played it because it became one of the biggest games of all time and helped bring the industry to that next level. One of the many kids obsessed with it at the time was a young 13-year-old Satoshi Tajiri. He credits that game with taking his interest in video games to that next level. Well, over the next few years, as a consumer, he struggled to find information about these games. He was looking for special techniques or tips on how to win, and it wasn't available. So in 1983, noticing that the supply was not meeting the demand, he started his own magazine called Game Freak. It was certainly nothing special at first. He wrote it by hand, photocopied the pages, and stapled them together. Throughout the 1980s, it did gain some popularity and evolved into a larger, more professional operation. Then toward the end of the decade, Tajiri became frustrated with the state of video games on the market. He says that they generally weren't very good, so he decided that Game Freak would try to develop their own games. Again, it was nothing special in the beginning, definitely more of a side project where he didn't fully know what he was doing. He actually had to physically take apart an NES to see how it worked so we can learn how to make games for it. But in 1989, the company finally released their first game. It was a puzzle game called Quinty in Japan, released under the name Mendel Palace in North America more than a year later. That one was made for the NES, but published by Namco. The first Game Freak game that was published by Nintendo was another puzzle game simply called Yoshi in 1991. 2 years later, Nintendo published another one of their games called Mario and Wario, which oddly enough is the only game that I've ever seen besides Mario Paint where you use that mouse to play with it. Here's what all this is leading to. The third game to be developed by Game Freak and published by Nintendo was Pokemon Red and Green for the Game Boy in Japan, later released as Red and Blue in North America about 2.5 years later. It was released in 1996, and that is when the world was first introduced to Pokemon. And I have to say, it was a miracle that this thing ever even came out. The big inspiration behind the game, and Pokemon in general, believe it or not, was bug collecting. Tajiri grew up in the suburbs of Tokyo in an area that was filled with nature. It was the perfect setting for one of his first passions, collecting bugs. It was actually a common activity among his friends and kids in Japan in general, but Tajiri took things a step further, to a point where his friends would call him Dr. Bug. He would design methods of catching them and categorize them and study them, but the hobby faded out as he grew older and his town became more urbanized. But in 1990, he thought back to those bug collecting days and came up with the main idea for Pokemon. He thought that the Game Boy was the perfect system for it, mainly because you can connect them together and they can communicate. There is so much more that could be said about this, but it took him 6 years to make it, and the whole thing was very ambitious and very risky because it put Game Freak in a shaky financial position. The employees were barely getting paid, some of them quit, Tajiri himself wasn't receiving a salary, and all of this with no guarantee that the game would ever be played by anybody. Tajiri himself has said, "When I finished Pokemon, I thought Nintendo would reject it. I was like a baseball player sliding into second base knowing he's going to be out, but somehow I was safe." But I mean, of course he was safe. It was a great game, a great concept that was made with care. And I don't have to tell you that it did end up being a big success. Something like 30 million copies sold worldwide and over 300 million over the course of their future games. Today, logically, they're one of the 3 companies that share the ownership of the Pokemon Company. I think the biggest lesson that we can take from this is don't be afraid to fail, because look at what this guy did. He repeatedly took things that he was passionate about and pursued them despite opposing circumstances. He started a magazine by writing it by hand and stapling the pages together. He started developing video games by taking apart a Nintendo and learning how to do it. And the thing that I admire the most is he continued to create Pokemon for 6 years, even when it appeared to be bankrupting his company. I don't think that he could have said it any better. Even when he thought that he was going to be out, he kept running anyway. Alright, moving on to Creatures. This one has to be mentioned because they're the 3rd company who shares ownership in the Pokemon Company, and this is where their CEO comes from. They have roots going back to a video game developer called Ape Inc., who is most known for their Mother series, or Earthbound as Mother 2 is called in North America. Ape Inc. was shut down in 1995, and Creatures was the new development company that was created using many of the same assets. Well, right around that time, when Game Freak was going broke working on that original Pokemon game, Creatures stepped in to help, giving them partial ownership of the franchise. They've since been involved in developing different Pokemon video games and the trading card game. Speaking of that trading card game, next up is Wizards of the Coast. They are most known as the company behind Magic the Gathering, introduced in 1993 and becoming amazingly popular throughout that decade. Well, in 1998, they made an agreement that legally allowed them to manufacture and distribute their own Pokemon trading card game outside of Asia, meaning all of those cards being collected by me and many others across the United States in the late 90s and early 2000s were made by Wizards of the Coast. It was a massive hit for them, to a point where they can hardly keep up with production. For a brief time, the Pokemon TCG was just about as popular as Magic the Gathering. In fact, the popularity of these cards can be considered a big reason Hasbro was willing to acquire Wizards of the Coast for an initial payment of $325 million. And that's in addition to future payments ultimately totaling $500 million. In 2003, the Pokemon Company reclaimed the international rights to produce the trading card game, essentially saying Wizards of the Coast can no longer do it because we're gonna go ahead and do it ourselves. So as of that point, they are no longer involved, but it was a messy transition. It led to all of these accusations inside of a lawsuit against what is now called the Pokemon Company. Wizards of the Coast claimed that they had already developed these 2 expansion sets, and the Pokemon Company was illegally stopping the release of them. Also, allegedly, the Pokemon Company hired multiple executives from Wizards of the Coast and used them to obtain all of this proprietary information. I'm talking about the methods and materials they used for making the cards, in addition to information that they used to solicit distributors and vendors. It was all settled settled out of court a few months later. None of the terms were disclosed to the public, so no one knows how it ended, but yeah, that was a messy transition. The final company that I want to talk about today is 4Kids Entertainment, because for years, they were Pokemon's exclusive US licensing agent. Whenever you saw a toy or plush or book or anything else that was officially licensed by Pokemon, it was 4Kids Entertainment making those deals. In addition to their involvement in the US release of the first few Pokemon movies and the first 8 seasons of the TV show. They were the ones who dubbed the Japanese anime into English and prepared them for the US audience, meaning that show that many of us were watching on TV back then was dubbed by 4Kids Entertainment. There is more to their business, but you can clearly see how much this Pokemon craze helped them grow. In the year 2000, they were actually number 1 on Fortune's list of the 100 fastest growing companies. In 2001, they became 3% owner of the Pokemon Company and extended all of their agreements with them as far as licensing and dubbing. All of it lasted until 2005, when at that point they sold that 3% ownership and ended all of their agreements when, again, the Pokemon Company decided that they would take over the work themselves. And 4Kids Entertainment has since filed for bankruptcy twice and no longer exists today. Let me know in the comments, what is your experience with Pokemon? Were you part of that initial craze, or did you join in later? Maybe this right here is the most time that you've ever invested in it, or maybe you've been following it for over 20 years now. And before you say it, I know there is a lot that I failed to talk about. I challenge anyone to cover all of it in this time frame, but hopefully I was able to hit on the bigger parts and talk about some of these lesser known companies that have played a big part in the overall success of the franchise. And finally, I'm just curious, what is your favorite Pokemon? Controversial pick on my end, but I'm gonna have to go with Snorlax. Sure, he doesn't do much, but when he does do something, it's pretty awesome. Anyone who's played the Pokeflute in the beach level of Pokemon Snap knows exactly what I'm talking about. So any thoughts on the franchise, the companies behind it, or the Pokemon themselves, leave it in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching. A chipotle is a smoked hot chili pepper commonly used in Mexican cooking, but much more applicable here. It's the name of the second largest chain of Mexican restaurants behind only Taco Bell. They currently have over 2,500 locations located across every contiguous US state. There's over 400 of them in California alone. The reason I'm talking about Chipotle today is because the last 5 years for them have been outrageously eventful, possibly more so than any other restaurant. Within that span, they have experienced a significant decline in both sales and reputation. You may remember all these foodborne illness outbreaks linked to their restaurants, but they've made what I would consider to be a full recovery. By almost any measure, they're actually doing better right now than ever before. The simplest, most impactful representation of this would be their stock price. In August of 2015, Chipotle stock was trading at a then high of almost $750. Within months of that, it was almost cut in half to the $400 range. That was directly following the big outbreak, leading to early 2018 when it was trading at around $250. And now today it is approaching $1,200. I told you that is an eventful 5 years. So today I want to take a look at the rise and fall and rise again of Chipotle. You know, compared to most food chains of this size, Chipotle is surprisingly new. I am actually older than Chipotle because it only goes back to 1993 when Steve Ells opened the first location in Denver. Now, Steve Ells has been passionate about cooking and food for practically his entire life. When he was young, I can't imagine he was unlike Remy from Ratatouille, just talking about cooking and trying to discover new flavor combinations. He ended up going to culinary school, and by the age of 25, he was living out his dream by working for a respected chef at a high-end restaurant. Again, much like Remy, but that's where the comparisons end, because Steve Ells came up with a solid idea for a new restaurant. He took note of all the taco and burrito restaurants in his area and figured that he could do the same thing, but a more high-end gourmet version of it. He took out a loan and convinced his father to invest a considerable amount of money and used it all to open the first Chipotle in the summer of 1993 near the University of Denver. Things weren't the best at first. He had converted it from an old 800 square foot ice cream shop, so the size and the layout weren't ideal, but there was enough good to outweigh the bad. He would come up with his own fancier twist on the ingredients, serve them in higher quantities. Chipotle has always been known for their larger burritos, but he was still able to keep the prices under control. All the main items were under $5. In fact, his unique balance of quality and pricing made him somewhat of a pioneer in the now popular industry of fast casual dining. It's basically trying to find the happy medium between fast food and casual dining, and Chipotle was one of the earlier ones to do it. In the words of Steve Ells, "I wanted to show that food that was served fast did not have to be a typical fast food experience." In the following years, he found additional investors and was able to subtly expand Chipotle into a chain of locally popular restaurants in the Denver area. Then, in early 1998, when there were about 14 locations, McDonald's became involved when they bought partial ownership of Chipotle. It was a minor stake at first, but by 2005, they had become 90% owner of it, though Steve Ells did remain in charge as Chipotle's CEO. As you would imagine, this is when their expansion was taken to that next level. It is not hard to see how having a fast food giant like McDonald's behind them would be helpful for their business. Aside from the actual money that McDonald's provided, they were useful in selecting which areas they should open new restaurants. They had a strong distribution system that could be utilized. They were helpful in securing better suppliers. There were more advantages than I can even mention here. But in early 2006, when the Chipotle chain had grown from 14 to about 500 locations with McDonald's involvement, McDonald's no longer wanted to be involved. They instead wanted to focus their attention on their core McDonald's brand, and really, it doesn't seem like the two are getting along very well. Obviously, the two brands are different, and because of that, it doesn't appear that the managers from the two ends ever shared the same vision for Chipotle. Considering how much the brand has exploded since, I can't imagine McDonald's is too happy with that decision, but at the time, those reasons were motivation enough for them to sell their stake in Chipotle to the public. Meaning, by the end of 2006, Chipotle was completely free for McDonald's, trading independently on the stock market. And from there, Chipotle continued growing, I think, faster than anyone could have predicted. Probably one of the bigger reasons for it would be their emphasis emphasis on fresh ingredients and, as they put it, food with integrity. What they mean by that is over the years, they had grown increasingly concerned with where their food comes from. I recommend that you look more into the details of it, but they became known for their fresh, responsibly sourced ingredients. To best show their success over this time, I'm just going to show you some of the key figures from their first 10 years apart from McDonald's. That 2006 IPO priced the stock at $22 per share, which had gone up to $42 at the end of the first day of trading. From there were some ups and downs, but by 2015, it was over 700. When looking at their number of locations, it had consistently increased to over 2,000. When you're opening so many new locations like this, you have to be careful of your comparable store sales, because it wouldn't make sense to open so many new restaurants if the existing ones were losing sales. And amazingly, even though they had quadrupled in size over that 10-year span, that was never an issue for Chipotle. Their comparable store sales growth remained positive during this time. It seemed like no matter how many they opened, it was never enough because the demand was always there. It may have been too high, in fact, because one of their biggest issues over this time was the fact that their lines were too long. I know I'm not the only one who has waited far too long to get their Chipotle, but as far as problems go, it's not the worst one to have. Considering they were opening more locations and selling more at each location, their overall sales jumped from $800 million to $4.5 billion over this time. And every one of these years was profitable, netting almost $500 million in 2015 alone. I don't know how any of this could have realistically gone any better. It really did seem like they were unstoppable. Then the trouble started. The first nationally reported story that got everyone's attention was in October and November of 2015. It was this terrible E. coli outbreak in 11 different states that was connected to many of their restaurants. 55 people got sick, 21 of which were admitted to a hospital. Not surprisingly, the public became very apprehensive about eating at Chipotle. Then, to make things worse, at a terrible time, right when everyone was scared, in December of that same year, they were linked to a norovirus outbreak that affected 136 people in Boston. For this one, it looks like the manager at a Chipotle went against company policy and forced a sick employee to stay at work. That person then helped pack an order for a college basketball team, and that team ended up getting sick with the virus. Now, these weren't the only outbreaks, but they were the big ones that received what many would consider an abnormally high amount of media attention. I'm sure that most of us saw the reports when it happened, but what fewer people may realize is just how much the company was hurt by them. The outbreaks occurred right at the end of 2015, so 2016 is where they saw the biggest impact. That year, their same-store sales decreased for the first time, and it was by 20%. Their overall sales decreased for the first time by about $600 million, which of course led to lower profits as well. It also eventually led to the resignation of their founder, Steve Ells, as CEO in 2017, who, as we've seen, had been the head of Chipotle from the very beginning. Then, to complicate things even further, when the public had them under a microscope looking for any kind of outbreak or breach in food safety, it happened again. In July of 2018, 647 people got sick, likely from eating at a Chipotle in Ohio. The restaurant wasn't keeping their food at safe temperatures, so that's probably what made everyone sick. At that point, I think the public had lost all of their patience with Chipotle because this sort of thing just kept happening. From 2015 to 2018, a combined 1,100 people were sickened from these outbreaks, and that led to a $25 million federal fine in 2020, which happens to be the largest fine ever in a food safety case. But like I've said, they have already made a full recovery from it and are pretty much doing better than ever. Despite the outbreaks happening through 2018, 2016 was really their only bad year, and I have a few reasons behind this recovery. The obvious one would be increased food safety measures. I mean, I would sure hope so. They hired food safety consultants, they're inspecting their restaurants more often, all the stuff that you would pretty much expect following these types of incidents. Another factor would be strong marketing, because they had to get the word out there about their food safety and their real ingredients. They quickly launched their most expensive marketing campaign ever that included their first nationally broadcast commercials in 5 years. They also hired a new CEO that's been making some big changes. When Steve Ellis left, he was replaced by Brian Niccol, who was actually the CEO of Taco Bell before this. Some of his changes include moving their headquarters from Colorado, where it started, out to California. His hope is that it would shift the culture of the company and bring them closer to their competitors. On top of this, they've been introducing some new menu items, such as their queso dip that actually took them a few attempts. I realize that fast food places introduce new menu items constantly, but it's uncharacteristic for Chipotle. Whenever I go there, I get the burrito bowl every single time. I see it from the people around me too. There's typically not much variety happening at Chipotle. Definitely not when you compare it to a place like Taco Bell. So these few new menu items have been big, and it appears that they've been working. Another factor would be their emphasis on online orders, which now account for about a quarter of their total sales. Their new app and loyalty program have been effective. You can now earn points that you could redeem for free meals. Deliveries coming from their app and their new Chipotle lane have helped reduce the lines inside. And maybe the most important part of their comeback has been a simple lack of outbreaks. I know, the bar set pretty low on that one, but time has passed, people have forgotten about them, and they don't seem to be much of a factor anymore, so people are less freaked out about eating there. It's pretty clear that many people want to eat there, so they're going to do it as long as there's nothing actively keeping them away. Let me know in the comments what you think of everything that's been happening with Chipotle. These have been crazy times, but it's looking like they may have been able to isolate these troubles and put them in the past. Let me know if you think that's the case. And I'm curious, how have you felt about eating at Chipotle? What I mean is, back when the outbreaks were happening, were you apprehensive or did you stop going there altogether? Because based on these numbers, it looks like that was the case for many people. And if you were one of those people, how do you feel about them today? Most have returned by now, so what brought you back? Had enough time passed without an outbreak? Was it the Chipotle